So as the sun goes down in the next few minutes, it will become the 8th day of Av, which means that tomorrow evening, as the sun goes down, we enter the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which is known as the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. And the thoughts I want to present and the structure I want to present regarding the true meaning of tragedy, or understanding Churban, as it's called in Hebrew, destruction, are based on a talk by Rabbi Mendel Kessin, who I do not know. And they really have expanded my understanding, and I wanted to share it with everyone this evening. So I remember a cartoon once, which was by Roz Chast, a very cynical type of a inventive, funny woman, if you can put all those ideas together. And she had a picture of a parade. She called it the Misery Day Parade. And with the idea that there's so many parades in New York, marking all these different occasions, why isn't there one to celebrate being miserable? And that's what I want to think about a little bit. Is Tisha B'Av a day for us to be miserable? You know, once upon a time, there was an ancient custom that when someone passed away, you would hire for a funeral wailers, people who would sit and cry out loud. They were practiced actresses, actors. They could raise a storm because it would make everyone sad. And then people would feel as though, well, at least people feel sad that he passed away. But of course, that's not at all what marking Tisha B'Av is meant to be about. But what is there about this day? After all, the most recent destruction of the Second Temple took place 1,953 years ago, maybe 55 years ago, depending on the count, and it's very remote. And the first temple, which we have from the prophets, was destroyed on the 9th day of Av. That happened 2,443 years ago, even before that. And also, I think it's interesting to reflect upon the fact that we, with modern media, we share in tragedies all over the world like no one ever has before us. And I think to myself, you know, if you turn on the news, and the de facto news in California is, oh, there was a wildfire someplace, and we have Mrs. Jones returning to her burned out home. And then the camera comes in and we watch someone crying, bemoaning their loss. And it is very sad. And we, of course, we feel empathetic, and we feel a sense of concern, a sense of wanting to help. But it certainly doesn't evoke a sense of loss on our part. So how do we relate to these days? So I think the key issue for us to approach Tisha B'Av is to understand the Jewish concept of Churban, of destruction, and to come to think of it differently than a building burning down. And that's what we want to approach today. And I just want to attach that to another idea, because right after Tisha B'Av, this year Tisha B'Av is Wednesday night, Thursday. On Shabbat, we call it Shabbat Nachamu, a Shabbos of consolation, where we feel consoled. It's a pretty quick turnaround, but I think if we understand what the source of our sadness, mourning, discomfort is, then we could also begin to open our eyes what it means to be consoled from it. Because after all, it's only to the extent that one has a perspective on tragedy that one can then find consolation. So the structure that Rabbi Kessin puts out is that if you go through human history, there are 3 moments of Churban, of destruction in human history. And I think as we go through them, you'll be surprised. The 3 moments are literally the day of Rosh Hashanah, the day when Adam and Chava were created and placed into the Garden of Eden and sinned. The second day is the 17th of Tammuz, which begins this period of 3 weeks. What happened on the 17th of Tammuz? It's the day that Moshe came down from Mount Sinai holding the tablets of law, only to encounter the Jewish people involved in the worship of the golden calf. And those luchot, those tablets, were smashed, broken on the ground, and a whole process of reapproachment to God had to ensue, which led to the building of the Mishkan, building to the tabernacle, which of course is the precursor to the temple in Jerusalem itself. And then the third moment is Tisha B'Av itself, the 9th of Av. And that's the moments, the day, the calendar date on which the first and the second temple was destroyed. And we're going to take a look at these three tragic moments in human history with an insight to them, which I think will then reshape, hopefully will reshape the way we feel as we approach Tisha B'Av. So let's talk about Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is Hayom Harat Olam. This is the conception, the birth, the beginning of human history. Rosh Hashanah is, in fact, the 6th day of creation. And as we mentioned, it's the day Adam and Eve were created, placed into the Garden of Eden, ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and were told that they would be expelled. They spent that Shabbat in the Garden of Eden, and then they left following Shabbat. What is this about? So we've alluded to this previously, but let's start from the beginning. The beginning point is there's only God. God is not conceivable by us, but we know from Maimonides and classical Jewish sources that God has the quality of Ein Sof. There's no end to God. There's no beginning point and ending point. There's nothing else but God. So therefore, everything is filled. There's no concept of space either, because God's not subject to any physicality or physical limitations. So there's only God. And then God decides to create. And to create means what we say in Hebrew, zulato, to make another or something other than God. That's a big idea. So that's this idea of Tzimtzum. God had to rein God in to create room, so to speak, but it's not just creating room. So when you think about it, what's the highest value creation, the most pristine creation, when we start from this understanding? There's only God, and then God is there's nothing else, and then God is going to create something other than God. So we need to understand that this ultimate creation is the soul of the person, is the neshama of the person. And let's think about that for a minute. This is a big idea. Why would this be the highest? Well, in a way, the neshama is not subject to death. It's not subject to time limits. It has a quality of eternality to it. It has a quality of not being physical. And we conceive of it, and these are very distant concepts which for us to sort out in our own minds, but we conceive of the neshama of a person as being like a portion of God or an image of God, or a so when God creates, in other words, God created lots of things, we know, and we'll talk about some of these things. But the most pristine, the creation closest in resemblance to God, and the creation most reflective of God's essence, reflective of, not equal to, is the soul of a human being, which is God's highest creation. Now, of course, God didn't conceive of creation in only spiritual terms, because as Adam named himself, there's earth and image of God combined. So God created a physical reality. And within that physical reality, created the physical makeup of human beings. And that's what the Torah tells us, that God crafted. Torah tells us in great detail. First, there was a physical form for Adam and Chava, and then there was a soul inserted into Adam and Chava. And then there was life. Then there was the pinnacle of God's creation. That's why Adam and Eve were created last, because they were the loftiest. They were the purpose, as we say, Sof Ma'aseh, the final act. Machshavat Chila was the first thought, the goal, the concept that God was out to create. So we have this moment that we celebrate on Rosh Hashanah, Hayom Chorat Olam. Today, human beings came into existence, Neshama and Guf. Now, what is this partnership? What was this partnership like in its very inception? So in its very inception, we should understand the task of the Neshama, of the most spiritual aspect of this new creation of human beings, was to purify and elevate constantly the physicality around it, the body itself, and ultimately the whole world. And that's a statement of the rabbis, that when Adam and Eve were created, God showed Adam everything and said, elevate it, bring it up. It's in your hands. You can crush it and make it meaningless, or you can elevate it and make it meaningful. Those are literally the words that the rabbis read into the initial conversation between God and man. And that was taking place. They were in a perfect setting in the Garden of Eden. But God also introduced there an opposing force. And again, the word Satan, Satan, means oppositional. It means someone who's there to prosecute, to probe and investigate and to challenge. And when Adam and Chava ate from the tree, something was destroyed. And that was the purity of the relationship between body and soul. At that moment, the balance was completely changed. And how does that happen? So these are some Kabbalistic ideas, but there was a contamination. The Kabbalistic word is zuhama. There was something anti-spiritual which entered the soul of human beings. And it disrupts this whole relationship. So now, instead of the soul being the dominant force, elevating, connecting more deeply with the Creator, becoming more one, narrowing any gaps in distance, enjoying the world and celebrating the gift of creation and celebrating the gift of life, instead, the physicality of the world begins weighing down the neshama itself. And this contamination means it's being dragged further and further and further away from God. And hence, a few things change, as we know from Genesis. Death is introduced into the world. What does that mean? Because to the greatest extent that we are spiritual, then we are eternal. And to the more extent we are physical, everything physical has to have a terminating point. It only exists for so long. Illness enters the world, stress, anxiety, worry. All these are byproducts of this natural attachment, this magnetism between the neshama and God, the Creator, weighing down, creating space, pulling in a different direction. This is the definition of destruction of Churban. And hence, the initial Churban, the initial moment of destruction, was this disruption of the entire arc of human spirituality. And Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden to work the world, with the sweat of their brow, occupying their attention, difficulty in childbirth, all of the changes which naturally ensued because this balance, because of this contamination, altering the nature, the dominance of the neshama, and dragging it down, and the ascendancy of the strength of the physicality of this creation of human being, it changes everything. That's tragedy. That's tragedy number one in human history. Not almost at the outset. We had moments or hours of basking in the pristine sense of having a spiritualized, pure neshama, unimpinged by its relationship with the body, and then that changed. This gives us an insight into what the word Churban means. Let's go to the next thing. 17th of Tammuz, the moment when God's coming down from Mount Sinai with the Luchot. And here again, we have to introduce this spiritual history of mankind. So we know from Pirkei Avot, 10 generations of decline in the world from Adam until Noach. Humankind had to be restarted, destroyed, and restarted from the seed of Noach, given a boost again. Again, there's decline, there's idolatry, there's forgetting about God. The whole connection between mankind and God practically disappears. Adam comes on the scene, Avraham comes on the scene. He and his wife Sarah build a family. That family is subjected to generations of slavery in Egypt. God rescues us. God destroys the antagonists of the Jewish people at the splitting of the sea. And the Jewish people arrive at Sinai, having been purified through these entire gamut of experiences, so that they listen to the word of God and they live, because their neshama has become decontaminated. The impact of this zuhama, of this contamination within their soul, has been rendered inert. Maybe that's a way of describing it that Rabbi Tessin mentions. So therefore, they're in a spiritual level. They're ready to literally wait the 40 days and nights for Moshe to come down with the luchot, with the tangible words of God inscribed onto material, again, spiritual and material being joined together in a unique manner, written by the hand of God. And again, they turn their backs on God. They worship a golden calf. They reactivate this inert, neutralized physicality inflicting their souls. And we have a moment of tragedy where we crash down to earth. The luchot, the tablets of law, have to be broken. A second set has to be written, very magnificent, but not equal to the first. And we're given, as we repent, we're given the privilege of building a house for God to inhabit and be our neighbor and live amongst us, so that we can connect more deeply with God, and we can slowly but surely, through this connection, through this elevation, resume the task of mankind, which is to create spiritual dominance over physical reality, so that the physicality can be elevated and become spiritualized. And the Jewish people do that. And they enter the land of Israel and they conquer the land, and they have this Mishkan, and 3 times a year they enter it, and then they build the first temple. And let's look at Pirkei Avot and understand what that's about. But before we get to the temple, let's just look at that second moment of tragedy. Just want to get clear. First was on Rosh Hashanah, eating from the fruit. Second was on the 17th of Tammuz, which begins these 3 weeks, but really is commemorative of a different tragic moment of Churban, of destruction. And now we get to the period of the temple itself. What happens during the temple times? Temple times are marked, as we know from Pirkei Avot, by the Jewish people 3 times a year entering the temple. And Pirkei Avot in chapter 5, the 7th Mishnah, details miracles that were obvious and apparent and visible and tangible when the Jewish people went, certainly in the first temple, I believe in the second temple as well, but the first temple was on a higher level. Second temple also was a miraculous place in that it was a place for people to connect with Hashem. We have a mitzvah in the Torah 3 times a year. We gather in the temple, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And what we should think about is that these 3 moadim, these 3 appointed times, was like a family reunion. It was like God saying, okay, let's get together. Let's draw close to one another. It's such an exciting time. It doesn't necessarily change who we are, but it inspires us and it brings us close, and it reawakens within us a much more deep awareness of our connection, our similarity to God, our opportunity to draw close to God. What were some of the miracles? You walked into the temple, there were sacrifices taking place. And of course, we don't use the word sacrifices. Korbanot, from the word karov, draw close, was an opportunity to draw close to God. There were no flies. There was no smell, even though there was a lot of stuff going on that could have created that. The fire on the altar never went out. It could pour rain. You could stand outside in the courtyard of the temple and see inches of rain pour down, and the flame remained the same. The smoke going up was straight in a line. What do all these things evoke? It evokes a sense that the physical constraints are diminished, and therefore the spiritual opportunities abound. That's this effect that the Beit HaMikdash had on everybody. So 3 times a year, we would have this family reunion, and we would reconnect, and we would become inspired and imbued with this idea, this self-concept, that in our essence, we are spiritual. In our essence, if there is an indescribable, transcendent God, there is you and me as the closest creation, the most able to bond, connect, become one with God. And again, I've used this reference before. When God comes looking for Adam and Eve after the sin, and says, let's go for a walk. Let's walk together in Gan Eden. Comfort level, connection, a soothingness of presence, things that are not easy for us to conceive of when we think about God. So what do we have by the destruction of the first temple, being rebuilt and it's destroyed again 1,953 years ago? What we have is not a building, but we have God moving away from us. We created circumstances which put barriers, limitations, constraints on the purity with which we are able to connect to God. Then finally, when the temple was destroyed, certainly for the second time, and the Jewish people disperse into galut, into exile, we see Hashem saying, I'm out of here. I'm gone. Not that I don't feel a connection, but it's not happening. So there's no reason for us to be in the same place, so to speak. And as the prophets in the first temple, so to speak, say, even when we're in the same place, we're not in the same place. You know, it's sort of like a family reunion where everybody's on their cell phone, checking their stock portfolios or watching their favorite movie. And the emphasis is not on reconnecting as God's children and in unison feeling the joy and celebration of being in proximity of God. So God, so to speak, says, I'm not coming to the party. There's no reason for this house to stand because I'm gone. Because even when I'm here, I don't feel a connection. I don't feel a yearning. I don't feel a bonding. And if anything, as we know, when you draw close to someone and you don't connect with the person, that itself can be its own barrier. Where do we see this played out the most clearest in the Torah? And I want to make reference to this. If you go to Genesis chapter 4, sentence 14, we find also another moment of destruction. This is real, tangible destruction. But we find that two brothers, Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel. Cain is motivated. Cain is motivated to draw closer to God, and he brings an offering. He's yearning for connection to God. His brother Hevel draws inspiration from what he does and surpasses him in offering. And lo and behold, God favors the offering of Hevel, leaving Cain feeling cut out, marginalized, unable to complete his desired connection with God. What ensues? Cain kills Hevel. God says, your sin is very great. And Cain responds and says, my sin is very great. And the words he uses is, I can't bear my sin. It's crushing me. Gadol avoni minaso. It's unbearable for me to sense the tragedy and the destruction that I've wrought. Miponecha astir. From you, your face will be hidden from me. Look how Cain, the murderer, articulates his sense of loss, his sense of punishment, not in physical terms, not in the value of his life, but in this essential understanding. After this whole chapter begins, I want to draw closer to God. I want to bring a Churban. I want to feel more connected to God. And he says, and what do I end up? Miponecha astir. Your face now, God, is hidden from me. And don't you see, that becomes the definition of tragedy. That becomes the definition of Churban. That's what we see when we look through the eyes of Cain as the after effect, the consequences of him turning his back on his brother. Am I my brother's keeper? Is there one God who's the parent of us both? Are we not, all the ideas that God actually counsels him there, pushed aside? But the mourning, the sense of loss that Cain articulates is miponecha astir, your face is hidden from me. So here we're approaching Tisha B'Av, the final blow of Churban, different than the first two. The first two had to do with us causing our neshama to be weakened vis-a-vis our makeup as human beings. It becomes hidden from us. The final one being God leaving the scene, literally walking away from us, leaving us really feeling as though we've lost an opportunity. But of course, when we look at today, we don't perceive that so readily. We got our lives to live. We've got our 4 Michelin star restaurants to visit and our Super Bowl games to enjoy. And we built a life in so many ways that overlooks the essential spiritual quality within us. And in a way, this magnifies the tragedy. There was an old allegory, which I remember now hearing it told to me on Tisha B'Av, and I didn't even make the connection. I'll tell it very quickly. There was once a shepherd. There was once a prince. And he couldn't get along with his father. And in a huff, he leaves the kingdom, wanders into the world. Princes don't do very well in the marketplace. There's not a lot of job opportunities for princes. Going around in a nice fancy uniform and shaking hands with people. There's not a big demand for that. So the prince becomes a lowly shepherd, and he's a shepherd for years and years and years. And then the king eventually visits the distant place that the prince, now today shepherd, is at. And the king rides through the streets in his royal chariot, and they announce, anyone who approaches the king and puts their wish on a piece of paper and throws it into the chariot, if the king picks up your request, you got it. So the requests come pouring in, and you can only imagine what they are. And he reaches down and he picks up the request of his son, today a poor shepherd. And he opens up the request and he starts crying. He recognizes the handwriting as the handwriting of his son. And what is his son asking for? Dear king, could you give me a warm blanket so that when the cold comes at night and I have to watch my sheep, I can feel a little bit warmer? Meaning what? Meaning he could have asked, reinstate me as prince. Let me move back to the palace. Let me become the proper heir to the king that I am. Let me assume the most dignified royal place within the realm. But he's so forgotten that that's his proper place and designation within the realm that he doesn't even ask for it. He doesn't even miss it anymore. So we have to look around today. People look, there's a lot that we see of a world of anxiety and stress, and people occasionally yearning for spiritual connection, people occasionally feeling a big void in their lives, parents bemoaning the fact that they're not closer to their children, spouses feeling as though, gee, this isn't exactly. So these are the spiritual embers within us, and they're not embers really. It's still there. Our neshamas are so powerful, and they're still, with all the layers and generations of distance and contamination, they still have tremendous force and tremendous energy. They still give off light within us. But it's very easy for us to just look someplace else and become distracted and forget about it. So we have Tisha B'Av. It's a great opportunity for us to think about what tragedy means, what the essence of tragedy is, what it would mean to us to be spiritually inspired. And then, of course, that's why Shabbat comes afterwards. It's Shabbat Nachamu, because on Shabbos we can re-enter a spiritual realm to the greatest extent we're capable, and so many of the distractions of the world we put aside, and we even get a neshama yetera, an extra soul, an extra spiritual supercharge within us. If we tune into it, we can feel it. And so we need to spend those 24 hours. Yeah, we're fasting. Yeah, we have customs. We don't bathe. We don't wear shoes. We act as if we're mourners so that we can tune in, hopefully, to what we really have to mourn over. And then doing that properly, we emerge with a rededication and a recommitment. Shabbos is coming. Shabbat is coming. Nachamu, nachamu ami. Be consoled, because there's portals of spirituality that we can enter. We can still open the Torah and study it. We can still refresh our neshamas no matter where we're at. We can still begin a process of drawing more close and more purified. And if we set our sights high enough and we devote ourselves to it enough, we can even start elevating the most physical aspects of our lives and making them more spiritual. And this is, I think, the fullest, richest, most meaningful way for us to think of tragedy, for us to enter the period of the 3 weeks, which we're coming towards the end of, and certainly for us to sit on the floor, as is our custom, on the 9th of Av, and to reflect upon what we're missing, that perhaps we're not tuned in enough that we're missing. And as we do that, we can feel a sadness which will then awaken our senses to where the solution lies, and rededicate ourselves to Torah study, rededicate ourselves to lives where it's not just about me and fulfilling my needs and wants, but it's a question of elevating myself, elevating the world, performing mitzvot, and ultimately recapturing the initiative, which was the very, very essence of what life was at its inception. And please God, we should have a meaningful Tisha B'Av, and we should grow from it, and we should emerge ready to be consoled a few days later. Take care.